Okie doke. So let's start in with just a bit of review so we know what we're talking about. We've been talking about the basic structure of the Bible and its contents, the most bare bones picture of it, and we talked about how we can break down the Old Testament into three different sections, and the New Testament into three different types of literature. Now, we're going to focus on the Old Testament today, also known as the Hebrew Bible, because Jewish people do not give too much attention to the New Testament because they're not so much into the Jesus. But the Old Testament is referred to as, it's an acronym. Do you remember what the acronym is? The Tanakh is the Hebrew Bible. And that stands for, anybody?
Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim.
Oh, God. Wow. Really?
No.
You're the star. I know. He could teach Sunday school.
So the Torah is sometimes referred to as the law, most commonly referred to as the law. But some people actually don't like that translation. Some people prefer the idea, the teaching. And recently I read something that I thought was very, very interesting, and it's in your notes there. Stuff that we talk about is on the right hand of the page. So notes from last week in discussion are in the right hand margin. So the word Torah, I've also heard it described, they say in a sort of nice comprehensive way, you can translate it as the way, which I think gives a nice connection back to the New Testament, which the followers of Jesus, before they were widely known as Christians, they were the followers of the way. So anyway, the Nevi'im are the prophets, the collection of writings about the prophets of Israel. And the Ketuvim is a broader group of just writings, literature, everything from the Psalms to the Psalms to
Minor prophets.
No, that'd still be in the Nevi'im. The writings in the Ketuvim are more varied, and they sometimes they're histories, sometimes they're just stories, smaller episodes. Sometimes they're song literature. Sometimes they're Ecclesiastes and Lamentations are just sort of like, life's really hard. Like it's literature about the dire realities of life. Anyway, should she not be here? She's really loud. Okay, all right. Anyway, so today we're going to focus on the Torah and what's in the Torah. So the
I have a question.
yes.
Sorry to do that.
No. Go for it.
No.
More.
So is the Nevi'im and Ketuvim, are they mixed together, or does it stop at a certain book and then it becomes?
That's actually a really good point that we haven't discussed, and that is the order of the books. The way that they're grouped in the Hebrew Bible is much more specific, and they tend to be in a different order in the Old Testament, in the way that in Christian Bibles. They are marginally more chronological in the Old Testament, whereas, excuse me, I haven't even had my treats. I'm already indulging. Sorry. Whereas they tend to be more grouped in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures. But I believe I'm right about that. But so like you'll get, you do see some of this grouping in the Old Testament when you notice that Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Hosea all kind of seem boom, 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 boom. Those are all prophets.
Right.
And so you do see some of that reflected in the Old Testament, but they are not necessarily in the same order as they are. Well, then don't eat it. But go sit down. Shh, go. Anyway, so he'll eat it. He likes it. Give it to him. So anyway, for the Torah, so let's take a look at the Torah today. The Torah basically it's the first 5 books of Moses. It's the first 5 books of the Bible traditionally ascribed to Moses. They're sometimes called the books of Moses. They are historically, like I said, traditionally ascribed, the authorship is to Moses, but there's a lot about that that's very, like, most scholars would go, that's not true at all. Like, it's not possible. Because there's not only stuff that wildly predates Moses, which, Lincoln predates every author who's writing about him today, so that's not impossible. But there's stuff after his death also, which is really hard to, to think that he wrote, the stuff that follows him. Now, there's not a lot, because basically in the Torah, near the end, he passes away, and then just a little bit of exposition and whatever. Generally speaking, there are a handful of views about the authorship of the Torah, and that is, but they tend to be some variant of a handful of authors wrote these. Now, some of it is, some of the stuff in the Old Testament generally is really quite old, like very old. Some of it shows signs of anachronism. So, like, for example, people write things about Abraham and his camels, even though even a rough estimate of when Abraham lived, there weren't really camels being widely used in that region, so it's unlikely. But it's a little bit like saying, when did the Native Americans of this region, where was this particular tribe? And you go, over Peoria way. You're like, they lived in Peoria? You're like, but it wasn't called Peoria at the time. So some of these anachronisms can be just simply chalked up to, people writing things down and either making a historical mistake and going, well, I'm sure they had camels then, right? No? Oh, my mistake. Or naming things for the contemporary reader to know where we're talking about. You know what I mean? And so a lot of that is, some of that can be ascribed to that, but also different writing styles, different eras. Like when you look at, I'm going to give you guys a handout on another day, that they can look at it, people who specialize in these languages can look at it and go, well, that's clearly much, much older Hebrew. Things like that. And that's much, much later Hebrew. So the general consensus, with varying views on the details, agree that this is a bit of a composite work. However, just to be a little bit, on the conservative side of it, that doesn't mean that no part of it could be traced back to a historical person identified as Moses. We just don't know about all the sources. And even within the Old Testament, there are quite a few references to works that they take as authoritative that just don't exist anymore. So one wonders, like, well, if that did exist, would they go, well, that should be in there, or we should, that would be very informative. But people who were writing things down, they say, well, is it not written in the Chronicles of the Wars of the Kings? You go, well, I don't know, we don't have it anymore. So there are older texts being used, and so, but we'll talk about the authorship in more detail at another time. But so the Torah basically starts with just the creation of everything. It starts in Genesis with the creation of everything, and boom, it just goes out, and we have this story that has, as we discussed in the first week, kind of a lot of the stories that we are familiar with. So we've got the creation, we've got the garden, you've got Adam and Eve, you've got their offspring, you've got Cain and Abel, right? You've got basically the development of humanity. And an interesting thing happens here is that you see this all start, this kind of the development and spread of humanity, and then God does what comedian Eddie Izzard refers to as the Etch-a-Sketch end of the world. He goes, he's just like the flood. He's upset, and he says, forget this, let's start over. He starts over with Noah and his family, right? So you have the spread of humanity, and that kind of goes like this, and then it contracts back down, and a new spread of humanity with Noah and so this is Adam and Eve. And Noah and his family and the generations that follow are basically sort of the new thing that we're following. And it goes wrong very quickly. The Tower of Babel story happens almost immediately, and finally God just goes, we'll roll with it. Okay? I'll have to find a new tack. Every time I start fresh, it just goes bad again. So he decides to, and we talked about it, I think in the first week, there's an interesting way in which the Bible periodically, it tells a story that sort of spreads out widely, and then it basically contracts to a point within the previous story, right? And it then goes from there. So the spread of humanity, well, forget humanity, we're going to go back to this new point, Abraham. God decides he's going to do something through Abraham, right? The peoples are doing their thing, and he says, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to focus on a project through this man and his offspring. He has no offspring, so that's a little tricky. But so on your page you can see the creation and the fall, the spread of humanity, the catastrophe, and then there is a Noahide Covenant. So we'll talk more about this series of covenants between God and people. But the first one, there's a covenant and a broken covenant here in the garden, but there's a covenant under Noah. And God says, okay, I'm not going to do this again. And he gives them a handful of rules, and it's kind of rules for everybody, not just Jewish people, because they don't exist yet. So before Abraham, there's no such thing as Israelites, no such thing as Jewish people, it's just people. That's it. Even during Abraham's time, there's no such thing as Israelites, there's no such thing as Jewish people, there's no such thing as any of that. It's just Abraham, it's just this dude and his offspring. Now I'm going to give you a couple words really quick. They're the patriarchs. Abraham is the first patriarch of the patriarchs that we'll be discussing. Prior to that, we do have patriarchs, but they're what are called the ante, A-N-T-E, meaning before, rather than A-N-T-I, meaning against. So antediluvian. So like before the deluge, so before the flood. Antediluvian patriarchs. The antediluvian people are the people from Noah and before. And you have some really interesting characters, including a person who doesn't die. So Noah's great-grandfather never dies, which is very interesting. He's in a whole list of people. What's that? What? Enoch never dies. Enoch is in this whole list of people. It's like, so-and-so lived this many years, and they had this child, and then they lived this many more years, and he died. And then it goes, next person, and he lived this many years, and then he had a child, and he then lived this many more years, and he died. It just goes on endlessly like that, and he died. And then it gets to Enoch, and it says, and he walked with God, and was no more, for God took him. And what's that?
Was he a son of like Jesus was?
Or Elijah?
Oh.
There's a lot of what you could call fan fiction. But interestingly, fan fiction that a lot of people around Jesus' time took very seriously and even quoted. So there's a lot of stuff that was written after the Hebrew Bible ends and before the New Testament begins that a lot of people were very familiar with, and some of it was heavily what we would call Enochian. Yeah, so people made hay of it. People noticed it and they're like, "This is real weird." And so anyway, that's just a side note. But the antediluvian patriarchs and the post-diluvian patriarchs, and these are the people that are some more of the stories that we know. There's Abraham and Sarah. Let's take a moment and name some of the people in the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. That's where we are now. So he makes a covenant with Abraham, and it's about offspring and a sort of legacy of children and offspring. And he has no children, but then they're very old, and God says, "Don't worry about that. Well, I'll make it happen." And Abraham, in fact, Sarah just thinks, "I'm a lost cause. So why don't you go ahead and have a baby with my handmaiden Hagar, who is, if I'm not mistaken, an Egyptian, I think. I can't remember, but
Yeah, Egyptian.
okay. Are you sure about that? Okay. I think you're right. Anyway, so so Hagar, please sit up. Please sit up. Be a civilized person.
Well, we have to sit up, so
They have to
I'd
sit
like
up.
it if you do.
Sit up. Everybody else.
I don't want to join you on the floor.
So anyway, so he has a son with Hagar named Ishmael. Ishmael, interestingly, is considered to be the progenitor of the Arabic peoples, and the Islamic lore says that their connection through Ishmael makes them, like their religion is the religion of Abraham. And so they consider themselves they're clearly an Abrahamic faith because they share common they share common legacy stories and things like that about all of the patriarchs and all that, but they claim to be the descendants of Ishmael, of Abraham. But Sarah does get pregnant, and she has, does anybody know? Who is Isaac, exactly. So Abraham has Isaac and Ishmael. So let's see, Ishmael and Isaac. So Isaac ends up married. He's an only child. Isaac gets married to anybody? Josiah? Rebecca. Right. So Isaac gets married to Rebecca.
Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, and Esau.
Isaac and Rebecca have Jacob and Esau. Now this is where some things turn around. Jacob, the famous stories of Jacob cheating Esau out of his birthright and things like that. Jacob, he is the first of the patriarchs to really be fruitful and multiply. He has 13 children, 12 boys, with 2 sisters and their handmaidens, right? So with four women, he has 13 children, and these are the 12 tribes. Here's the thing: Jacob has another name. Don't say it. Anybody know? Jacob has another name.
Oh, I don't know
Is it
Israel.
Israel. Because Jacob has an encounter. He cheats his brother, and then he goes and he meets. He goes away. He runs away, and then on his way, many years later, back to meet his brother. And there are all sorts of ways you could, do psychotherapy on, like, psychologize this. Please stop the extra noise. And he, in the night, he encounters an angel. You may remember this. I think it was part of the liturgy a handful of weeks back. He meets an angel, God, a man, an angel, hard to say, and wrestles with him all night long. And interestingly, this man says, seeing he could not overcome Jacob, which is a weird thing because he then identifies himself. He says to Jacob, you have struggled with God and with man and have overcome. He says, all right, let's put an end to this. And he jerks Jacob's hip out of socket, leaving him with a permanent, like an indelible memory of the event. But Jacob won't let go, and he says, I won't let go unless you bless me. And he renames Jacob Israel, which means struggles with God, strives with God. And the L in there, L is God. It's the northern term for God. The southern term is Yahweh, and you'll see both names kind of in this variant usually, Yahoo. You'll see them both show up. But so, Jacob is Israel. His offspring are the 12 tribes of Israel. So before Jacob saying the term Israelite, saying the term Jewish, in fact, even now, Jewish doesn't make any sense unless you're specifically talking about the offspring of his son Judah. So anyway, so if you know the Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, then you know that a famine in the land, they send their brother, the brothers do not particularly like their youngest at the time, youngest brother Joseph. There's another son born named Benjamin later, but they don't like Joseph. He seems boastful and arrogant to them, so they sell him into slavery. He ends up in Egypt, where he does very well for himself and becomes vizier of Egypt. And
second in command to Pharaoh.
exactly, second in command to Pharaoh. And many years later, the tribes just living in the region of Canaan, which we would call Palestine today, the tribes they experience a famine, and they hear that Egypt is doing well, so they go into Egypt to look for aid. They encounter their brother, not recognizing him, and he plays a trick on them to kind of get back at them without being too awful to them. But then finally, they all reconcile, and Joseph arranges for his entire family to be brought into Egypt for their care and taken care of, and he establishes them in the north in the land of Goshen, which is a nice plot of land. Exodus begins. The book of Exodus starts basically in the first paragraph or so with, "There arose a new Pharaoh in Egypt who knew not Joseph." So they've been in the land for some generations now, a generation or two or whatever, and whether that's a euphemism for saying he doesn't care for Joseph or his people, or whether it just means enough time had passed that he didn't really know of any reason of this Joseph person who was so prominent. Either way, they were not overly fond of this Semitic group of people in the north. And so the Pharaoh begins to oppress them and put them to work and things like that. And this begins the bondage in Egypt, from which, who's the person who leads them out? Moses. Abraham's back here. Now we're in Egypt. So people sometimes wonder, they're like, okay, but they're in Egypt, when do they? So it goes, they make their way into Egypt with the last of the patriarchs, right? That's when they go into Egypt under Joseph, the 12 tribes. Once there's a big group of people, they make their way because of famine into Egypt. Things ultimately go bad for them, and Moses has to bring them out. Moses is encountered by God, and he says, "I don't like what's happening with my people. Please take them out." And that's basically, and then while they're he does take them out. We've all heard the stories of the plagues and things like that. But they wander in the desert for 40 years. And no answers, Elijah. Do you know why they wander? Why would they wander for 40 years? It's not that far back to Canaan. Anybody remember? It's for their belly aching. God gets really tired of the way that they behave. He's like, and this is an interesting point, just as a religious observation, is that people like to talk about faith and like, well, hey, that is unacceptable and distracting. Get to the chair and sit down, be quiet. Well, then leave. Go. So the thing that people like to say when they're arguing against religion or a particular religion is they like to say, well, it's just a bunch of, this or fables or whatever else, and they're just asking to believe in stuff, without any evidence or proof. Actually, if you look through the biblical record, so often what they're saying is, why aren't you even trusting your own eyes? They say it all the time. They say, were you not there? Did you not see? Have you not heard? Right? It's about like all the evidence. Jesus says later, he says, you have seen, like you can look at the sky and know what the weather's going to be tomorrow, but you can't see the signs of the times. You don't know what's going on here. You can't tell. They're constantly actually asking people to, at the very least, believe your own eyes. He says, they say in Exodus and in the rest of the story, because basically everything that happens in Exodus is then covered in the remaining, because that's only the second of the 5 books, bless you. So Genesis, Exodus, and then, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and why did I send Elijah away? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And those are all basically the Exodus story. Genesis is everything that kind of precedes it. Exodus and after is part of the Exodus story, because what you get in Leviticus is a whole lot of law. It's a ton of law. Numbers is basically a tallying of the peoples and records of things that were said or espoused or taught by Moses. And then Deuteronomy is, again, it's just a lot of stuff, but it's all related. It's all before they make their way back in. It's all during that 40 years. And when people study their Torah, what they're doing a lot is they're studying the law. They're studying that, what was given, the words of God to Moses and things like that. So, but yeah, a ton of times they say, like, were you not there at the edge of the sea? Did you not see what God did for us when he parted the waters? And so it's like the overriding story is actually never underestimate a person's ability to deny even their own eyes, deny even their own experience. So anyway, so the reason for the belly aching, the belly aching, and they're like, but we're hungry, wouldn't we be better off in Egypt? Oh, and he says, stay here, just behave yourselves. I'm going to go up and talk to God on the mountain and maybe get some law or whatever. We'll see what God's will is, blah, blah, blah. While he's away, they build the golden calf. And there's just all sorts of instances of whining, moaning, and complaining. And finally, God says, all right, you guys aren't going into the Holy Land. The next generation will. The reason for the wandering for 40 years is to let one generation die.
Interesting.
So that they will die off and their children, he's just like, I've rescued the people, but none of you ingrates is going to get in there. Even Moses doesn't get in because Moses makes a mistake.
That kind of bothered me.
Yeah, right. But he does something. He does not completely trust in God. He goes, God says do it this way, and God's like, didn't we do it the other way before? And he's like, and Moses just does it the previous way, and God's like, I say it to the kids all the time. I'm like, what did I tell you to do? And so it's one of those. And he's like, all right, fine. And so Moses gets to see the promised land, but he doesn't get to make it in. But what they do receive is they receive a law. And the law is something very interesting because the law is a covenant also. So when we talk about covenants, there is something of a covenant kind of in the first case with Adam and Eve, but that's broken. The Noahide Covenant is interesting. It's not broken in any obvious. I mean, it's sort of broken. But there's it's basically to like behave this way. Broadly, it's very few rules. It's less than the 10 Commandments actually. But with Abraham, the primary thing is if you will be my people, and if you will follow what I say. Which, until you get to Moses, is actually just kind of on a case by case. God wants us this. God says do this. God whatever. But it's not really enumerated very strongly. But the main thing is what we would call, why am I forgetting the word? Monolatry. So people will say things and be like, archaeology is discovering that like actually in ancient Israel, people were really polytheistic and they believed in a lot of gods. You're like, haven't you read it? Of course, it's all over the place. It's the constant complaint. It's like, don't do that. You're doing it again. Don't do that. So like anybody who's like, actually, like they clearly haven't read it because it's the nonstop problem is polytheism. Now, the interesting point that should be made is that it's not immediately, obviously, a switch from polytheism to monotheism. What it is from polytheism to monolatry. So like we know the word idolatry, but it's not that they were told there are no other gods. In fact, there's even indication in the text that there are nods given or indications given to other gods in some way or another being if not existing, just a thing that has to be reckoned with, right? But monolatry is expected, which is the worship of just one God. It's a kind of a patron God situation. And many ancient Near Eastern specialists have observed that the Mosaic Covenant strongly resembles other what are called suzerainty treaties, things where a powerful ruler in a region will work up a sort of vassal treaty with people over whom he could just run roughshod, but in fact they kind of work it out in the details and they become a vassal state to this larger ruler. And many people have observed that the language of the Mosaic Covenant strongly resembles this, and maybe even actually as far back as some of the Abrahamic, I'm trying to remember, I don't want to switch those, but either way, a lot of this talk is not necessarily that, in the same way, it's not that there's only one ruler in the whole world, but this is my local ruler and he's going to treat me poorly if I don't have a vassal relationship with him. In the same way, God offers his protection against many of the ravages of the world if you worship only me, if you do follow my word, follow my rules. And it's interesting because people make a big point of saying that says God just wants to be worshipped and that's not. Actually, remember what I said about all these problems. This is a project that God has going. These covenants are something that God is doing to deal with the state of the world, which happened all the way back here, right? The fall. The world is just a really rough place, and he's got to find a way, an avenue through it for people. And these covenants are not necessarily just about his endless worship. They are actually a project and how he wants things to be. So he's working that project out. And the Mosaic Covenant is specific to the people of Israel. The Mosaic Covenant is because God comes in and says, okay, all these other people in the world, all the Gentile world, all the whatever, these people they all got their gods and they got whatever. And God says, he says, they are to be my portion. I'll take this group of people and he's going to do something with this group of people. And there's an interesting way, as we sort of find out in the language as it proceeds, as they proceed to become a nation, there's the idea of something called a priestly class. And we'll get into that more, but the function of the priest and how they function in society. But yeah, so God has a project, and basically the Torah ends with they've been given this way of living, some rules. And people like to it gives endless, hard to fulfill rules. More laws were passed in 1 year in California, I think last year, than there are in the entire Torah. So it's it's not, and many of those, if you take away the laws that are specific to temple procedure, specific to the priestly class within Israel, that takes away over half of the laws. So it's actually, just to give it a little bit of context. But there are 613 laws, I believe, that are enumerated in the Torah for the people of Israel. And I believe over half of them are specific to temple procedure and the law. And it's interesting, it's also worth noting, because she mentioned it today, that the idea of something being unclean, the key word there is ritually unclean. Because, and as we like to do, we tend to overlay all sorts of ethical and moral concerns. We're well, you're bad because of something. But actually, legally speaking, many things that we think of, and we think, well, that's ridiculous to say that somebody's bad or unclean. They're not saying they're bad, they're saying they're ritually unclean, which is very distinct. It's an important distinction that people don't often make, because we like to rush to moral judgments. But one other thing, because she mentioned it, the Samaritans. And we're going to talk more about the Samaritans and who they are and how they figure in, because knowing who the Samaritans are makes a lot of sense of a lot of things that are in the New Testament, and they're very historically interesting. And they're around today. Not a lot of people hear about them, but Samaritans exist today. They're very low in number. They live in an area around a mountain called Mount Gerizim, and they have a Pentateuch. So it's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's the Greek word for the 5 books of Moses, Penta. They have a Torah that is super old in very archaic Hebrew. But in Israel. Although they probably, I think on the West Bank, so not Israel. I don't exactly know how that all divides, but it's in Palestine.
It's called Samaria, isn't it?
Not anymore. I can't think of what they're called, but the Shomorim or something like that. But they still live very isolated in this area. There's another group that lives further south in Israel, but near Tel Aviv, I think. But I could be totally making that up. But I know there are two distinct areas, but one of them is still around their traditional land in what was Samaria, they're called the Shomronim, I believe. The Shomronim is the word for Samaritan, but they still hold their Passovers, their Yom Kippur. They still sacrifice sheep and everything else. They still roast them and everything. They still do this stuff. And what's interesting about them is that they maintain that everything from the time, which we'll talk about in the next one, everything from the time that David transferred worship to Jerusalem is illegitimate. Because after they move into the land, after Moses, they follow Joshua into the land of Canaan, they settle, but worship is held on Mount Gerizim. There are other times when it's done at Shiloh, but primarily they are to set up camp and set up this tabernacle, which is a precursor to a temple. It's a mobile tent-like temple. They're supposed to set that up on Mount Gerizim and hold things like that, and they still do to this day. But later on, when David decides to set up shop in Jerusalem, he transfers the tabernacle and everything else to Jerusalem and makes that the center of worship, moving it from, I can't remember if it was at Gerizim or Shiloh at the time, but he moves it to Jerusalem. And the Samaritans have maintained for millennia that was an illegitimate move. They were always supposed to be at Mount Gerizim. They're still there today. In the early 20th century, their numbers were in the very low hundreds with really considerable genetic issues because of their inbreeding. But they have been upping their numbers and kind of finding wives from outside. They're unlike Jewish people. They run patronymically, like it's not patronymic, the paternal. They do things paternally. So like if you're Jewish, if your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish. If your father's Jewish, you can sort of decide for yourself. Samaritans do it paternally. If your father's Jewish, you're Jewish. If your father's a Samaritan, you're a Samaritan. But so their numbers are on the increase. But people don't realize, they think like the Samaritans were a group of people a long time ago. They're still around today, and they still have and scholars, when they trying to look at translations, they often will use for the Torah portion, because the Samaritans don't have or use any other part of the Tanakh. It's just the Torah, the first 5 books. They will often use the Samaritan Torah for comparison, because it's crazy old. And so it's very, very interesting. And there's subtle differences too, here and there, in the texts. But yeah, so by the time that when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well, this is talked about. And it goes over a lot of people's heads because they don't know the relationship between them. But she says, even though most Jewish people, for reasons we'll talk about later, most Jewish people did not believe the Samaritans to be Israelites or related at all. They treated them as foreigners because of some political division. But she says to him, she says to Jesus, in contrast to this view, this strongly held Jewish view, she says, our ancestor Abraham, going, we are Israelites. I know you guys don't think so, but we are. Our ancestor Abraham built it. Jacob? I think it was either Abraham or Jacob. I think it's Jacob. Our ancestor Jacob built this well. And, but you Jews don't care for us, whatever. And Jesus says, and he doesn't deny her that. He doesn't say it's not the case. He says, but salvation is to come through the Jews. He basically says, yeah, but you can't cut us off either. You can't just say we're all illegitimate, because we're part of this story as well. And in fact, presumably talking about himself, salvation is going to come through the Jews.
So would a Samaritan identify himself as an Israelite also
Yes.
then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here, I mean, we'll go into it in greater detail, but basically what happened in the north and the way that a sort of hostile takeover of the north happened, importing and exporting a lot of people. The southern Jewish people basically looked at them as like, there's no knowing who's up there. We don't know who you are. And Samaria was the capital of the north. And they said, you're basically all foreigners now. We don't care. And the Samaritans said they did not deport 100% of the people in the north. We're Israelites. And they maintained their ways and still do today. And so this treatment of the Samaritans as foreign peoples had a lot to do with some population shifting that happened that we'll talk about. But so last little thing. So yeah, the Torah is very interesting. If you're ever interested in, go on YouTube and look up the Samaritans, and they have a very, very old Torah. But the last thing is, really quick, because we're going to be moving forward in time, we should just quickly ask the question, what does BC and AD mean?
Before Christ.
And what?
After that.
No. So, before BC does, in fact, mean before Christ, you're right. But here's the problem. Jesus was born, interestingly, about 4 BC. So he was born 4 years before Christ. What? He's probably born about 4 BC. But then he died in about 30 AD. He died in about 30 after death. What? He died 30 years after his death. Makes no sense because it doesn't mean after death. So this is a chronological this is just a chronological dating. This is just a chronological error. Figuring out exactly like when they set the calendar, and they wanted to set it around Jesus's birth because they considered him so pivotal. But honestly, if he was born in the time of Herod the Great, it means he was probably born between say 2 and 5. A lot of people land on 4 BC. Okay, that's a mistake. But this is a slightly bigger mistake. AD means Anno Domini, which for those of you, yes.
Do you have wipes?
They'd be in the car or in the bag. Go find them.
In the bag.
I don't have the bag.
Look, wipes.
I don't have them. Go.
Oh.
Hey Laura, go. You're interrupting.
I'm not leaving you.
Okay, go.
White.
Go. Hey Laura.
That is my shoes.
Anyway. So, anno, like your annual flowers, your perennial, annual means, or anno means year, and domini, where we get the word dominion, is Lord, year of our Lord. So, anno domini means year of our Lord. So he died in 30. So everything after his birth is in the year of our Lord's, whatever.
Okay, so it's BC and then it immediately becomes AD.
Yeah. Now, the other thing about this, when you're reading things, you may have noticed in recent, like in the last decade or so, people have stopped using BC and AD because not everybody believes in Jesus, right? So what they use is BCE and CE. CE means common era, the common era. Still divided roughly on the same lines. Anything that you would see in BC, or sorry, anything that you would see labeled AD, you could just immediately label CE without having to change the year or anything. There's no shifting.
So who uses these terminologies?
Everybody in the scholastic.
People in the,
Yeah.
okay.
If you open a book, no author will write BC or AD anymore. For a wider public audience. It's considered culturally insensitive to just sort of like go, just anybody.
The whole world revolves around
The whole
Christ.
world revolves around
You're
Jesus,
not
like
in that religion.
in the year of our Lord. So people try not to do that anymore, and they just use a more neutral term, the common era. And then B means before common era. So, oops, I can't spell today. So before the common era. So anyway, so that's and a lot of people, I find a lot of young people don't know this. I don't know how. Just to make sure we're clear, the way that the centuries work when we talk about it, the centuries are always one off. So but do you ever find that people like make that mistake a lot? Because you're in your second decade in your teens, but you're in your third decade in your 20s, right? The same thing. The first century is not the 100s. The first century is from year 1 to 100. The second century is 101 to 200. And so if I say the 14th century, we're talking about the 1300s, right? If we're talking about the 20th century, you ever notice that was the 1900s? And it's really, people, sometimes they just get into autopilot and they go, oh yeah, it was the 20th century, 1978, when I was born, 20th century. And they go, but they don't always go, isn't that weird? But that's why. So if we happen to mention a date, just remember, it's always one off. Yeah, no, we're good. That's everything. So have a wonderful week, and next week we'll be talking about the Nevi'im, the prophets. So we'll and a little bit of the history of why they were so vocal about stuff.
Why they became prophets.
Why they became prophets.
And others who wrote did not.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's the history. That's basically the history of the prophets is the history of Israel when they're in the land.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Very
Absolutely.
interesting.
All right,
Thank you
so,
for sharing your knowledge with us.
You're very welcome.
Do some homework.
It's fun stuff.